Dialect and group membership. Now, in the context of Norway, a small place within Norway, we will look at the meaning or the social meaning attached to dialect versus standard language. So, in this place, for instance, use of dialect was directly related to local organization and values. Local organization would mean how the society was segmented in terms of occupational differences. Now, this was a small town which was on the port, and here most of the people were strongly attached to their local identity, and for that the use of local dialect was given a lot of importance because it sort of denoted or it somehow reflected a commonality of descent. That means, they were all from the same descent, they were almost like a family. These were the messages that they were giving. Over here, everybody knows everybody, so it was like a system of a huge family living together, and that for that sense of solidarity, the examples were sort of given in terms of the use of dialect. Now, in this specific part, there were these extremes of wealth were and inequality related to it were absent. In that part, most of the more or less people were making sort of like the same amount of money, and they were more or less like each other. And that also might also account for their solidarity and the sense of belonging that they showed to each other, and they showed it to each other by deliberately using the dialect. Now, coming to think of it, these people, what was their linguistic repertoire? These Norwegians, they had new dialect, of course, but there was also historically a part in Norway which was this elitist part, and that was where the main administration was coming from, the governance was coming from, and they always used the standard language. And because these were the ones who had introduced the standard language, so standard Norwegian was related to a higher status, while across the personal networks and across other local networks, the language use was more in dialect rather than the standard form. And we talked about it, that how, because they were the elite were the one who had actually brought in the standard language, that is why the standard language was related to a higher status, and there were many functions of the elite, many functions of the government that had to be sort of performed in the standard language. Now, one of the main things for which standard language was used was schooling. So in schools, it was the standard language that was used for dissemination of education, and also in the working of the government, standard language was very much there. But because this was a small town, most of the time they were, even when they're working in small factories or workshops, they were close of kin, were working like huge families together. So there was a lot of importance given by the local people to the dialects. And most of the time, when people who were working for the admin were usually the non-locals, they paid lip service to this sense of solidarity with the Norwegians, but in any case, they were sort of more inclined towards the use of standard language rather than the dialect. And what also was happening at the other end, and that was that dialect was being associated with lack of education and culture. Now, this was something that the locals were strongly resenting. They understood that this is how they were viewing their dialect, but they were very attached emotionally to their own identity, and they resented this looking down upon their dialect. So, if anybody within the local networks used standard language, that was seen as a mark of standoffishness, that somebody has a chip on one's shoulder, and that was also shown as a lack of respect for the locals, and it was also seen as a sign of social distance, that this person doesn't want to be a part of the local community, and that it is no, he or she is not from us, they are different. So, meanings attached to dialects were very much regular and persistent, and they were then, this means, regulated through social ties. That is, your relationships were identified with the use of dialect or standard language. And that is how identity was negotiated. Now, when I say negotiated, I want to highlight this point also, that although we all have some aspect of identity which might be more or less stable, like we are males or females, any gender, we are, born where we are born, we have this ethnic identity. But then we also negotiate our identity through the choice of the language that we use. So, in order to show affinity or being a part of the local community, people would use this local dialect, and even for people from that local community, to show their distance from a local community which might not be given that kind of respect, might use standard language and demarcate his or her social distance with the locals.